again, apologies, I'm so sorry. Let's get right into it. Yeah, so my name is Lauren. I am a biologist with Common Murre Restoration Project, which is a collaboration between Cal Poly Humboldt and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So as already mentioned, Paul is a collaborator of ours. He's from the Seabird Protection Network. And so we're going to be talking today about our work with seabirds on the California coast. Yeah, and so my half of the presentation will be about the monitoring that my group does, and then Paul will be talking more about outreach later. And so what we really want to talk about today are the influence of planes and boats on our seabirds that we monitor, and in particular how COVID may have affected both aspects of those things. So to give you kind of a perspective on where we are, we're talking about the Bay Area. The blue dots on the map on your right are yeah, so these are areas that we've monitored in the past, but for today, I just want to talk about two. Point Reyes in the north is, as you may know, a national seashore, very low development, but a lot of seabirds out there. And then we're also going to be talking about Devil Slide Rock today. And so that is a seabird restoration. So there was an oil spill back in the 90s that wiped out the murres at Devil Slide. And so that's been an ongoing project that we've been working on since the 1990s to restore and protect those birds. And so we know it's a very vulnerable population, and so we're very concerned about making sure that they're okay. So in our case, we want to see how disturbance changes over time and how those birds are reacting, in particular, you know, at Devil Slide because they're vulnerable, but also at Point Reyes where we know there's a lot of birds that maybe don't get monitored so much aside from us. And so in terms of how do we record disturbance, I'm going to use some of our techs from the summer, Declan and Sam. And so when they were out this summer at a seabird cliff, whenever they're performing surveys, we tell them to always be on the lookout for any kind of a plane or boat disturbance. So if a couple of planes fly over, the things that they do is first they stop and then they focus on the potential disturbance, and then they kind of run through a checklist of questions. So first, we're interested in the detection zone. So we primarily monitor boats and planes within the detection zone. This in part is because it limits the amount of space that we have to specifically monitor, but also we know that about 90% of all disturbances to seabirds occur from planes and boats in this area. And so that will be at 1,000 feet or below above sea or above ground level, and then within 1,500 feet horizontal distance of any cliff. From there, they'll ask questions about was a disturbance caused and what was the severity? Well, let's go through an example just to show what that looks like. And so this yellow kayak is very close by one of our seabird cliffs down here. And so we'll just kind of walk through this. So detections are what we consider just anybody in the detection zone. You can think of it as traffic. And so throughout this talk, I'll be using the binocular icon for detection. And so this boat up here is within 1,500 feet of a cliff. So we'd say, yes, this is a detection. The next step is to ask about disturbances. And so how, you know, what are the birds affected? Are they showing an obvious visual response? And so we'll see things like agitation. So murres, they do a head bobbing. If you've ever seen murres upset, they do that very obviously. Cormorants may be waving their wings around, flapping wings. Displacement occurs when the birds are physically moving away from their nest, but while still on the cliff. And then flushing, they would just leave entirely. So you can see up here that 4 cormorants have flushed from the rock. So you would definitely consider this a disturbance. So it's both a detection and a disturbance. So for both of these measures, we would represent them as rates per hour of observation based on how many hours we're out at the cliff. And so to give you kind of an idea of what this looks like, so looking at the long-term detection patterns, think of this as traffic at each location. So on the y-axis here, we have detections per hour. And then on the x-axis down here, we have months. And so we're typically out between April and August. And so when I look at this screen, what I really see is that there's 2 really obvious things. First is that traffic is much higher at Devil Slide. And secondly, that the patterns are quite different, where you have not too much activity early on at Point Reyes, and it gets much higher in July and August. And then at Devil Slide, it starts very high and then declines as we get later in the year. And this can be explained based on what types of craft we see. So generally watercraft are similar in that it's low early in the year and gets much higher in July and August. But the big differences between these sites are based on aircraft. So Point Reyes is pretty undeveloped, no real airports super close by, whereas Devil Slide is very close to airports, which we'll talk about in a second, and so much higher traffic from aircraft. So if we consider where Devil Slide is, it's just south of San Francisco, so really close to the San Francisco Airport SFO and just north of the Half Moon Bay Airport. So there's a lot going on here. And so if you're a pilot, if you're going to look at an aeronautical chart, it's going to look something like this. It's very complicated. I'm not going to walk anybody through this because there's a lot going on. But the big thing to keep in mind is that SFO is very close by. And so Generally, if you're a recreational pilot, you don't want anything to do with commercial aircraft, and so you're going to be flying, maybe along the coast and as low as possible to stay out of air traffic. And so because we're just north of Half Moon Bay, it might be really nice to fly down the coast to the Half Moon Bay airport, but unfortunately there's a little seabird colony right there, which is not on the main aeronautical maps. This is a copy of our outreach materials, and so in many cases pilots are trying to do right when they're flying, but they're not even aware that there are seabirds there. And so Paul and his team do a lot of outreach just to let people know that there are seabirds there. In terms of watercraft, during the MPA process, several special closures were enacted in 2010. And for those, the main point is to keep boats out of those areas. And in our case, it's to protect seabirds that are breeding there. And so each of our field sites has a special closure there. So at Point Reyes, it's this black box with the the black box around it. So those go out to about 1,000 feet south of the seabird cliffs, and it's about 3 miles long. And so no boats permitted in that area. In red, you'll see the State Marine Reserve, which boats are permitted in there, but not allowed to fish. And so our biologists, when they're out there, they will record any violations and report them to the relevant authorities. At Devil's Slide, we also have a special closure. It runs just north, so it's about 300 feet northwest and south of Devil's Slide Rock, and then the whole area in between the mainland and the rock itself. So from here, for the remainder of my part, we're going to talk about different time periods that we're really interested in. So I'm going to present some data to you about detections and disturbance rates. Early on, before the special closures and the MPA were established, we have some early data. From 2011 to 2019, we saw some quite major declines in disturbance, which were really great. And then 2020 kind of flipped everything on its head, both in terms of how we interacted on the monitoring side, as well as what Paul and his team could do with outreach. And so I'll be talking about both detections and disturbances from a couple field sites. If we start with Point Reyes, and we're talking about watercraft in particular, we'll have detections on the left and disturbance on the right. Again, the y-axis is detections, and we picked July because it's the busiest month. And so you can see that there are the early, the middle, and the late period. And the first thing that stands out to me is that there was a huge amount of traffic in 2020, just lots of boats on the water. But if you look at the disturbances, there really weren't that many. And so we see that even though there were a lot of boats, that they were mostly respectful, and that very rarely did we have any issues with people getting too close to the birds. If we take a look at special closure violations, we see those are slightly higher in 2020 and they kind of go back to normal afterwards. And then with the SMR, with the protected area, we saw fishing was a little bit higher in 2020, but again, it kind of goes back to normal in 2021. And so the Devil's Slide numbers for watercraft look very similar to this. So kind of what we interpreted is that we saw a ton of traffic. A lot of people probably didn't have a lot to do, trying to figure out what we're doing during the pandemic. And maybe we had a couple people getting too close, maybe fishing when they weren't supposed to. It was possible they didn't know that they weren't allowed to do those things, but generally our outreach has been really effective. When we talk about aircraft, though, specifically at Devil's Slide, I'm going to show some graphs from May and from June. And so what we see is that the pattern looks quite different. And so again, we have detections here on the x-axis, sorry, on the y-axis, which indicates traffic. So you can see much more erratic, a lot of differences. And you can see in that COVID period, really elevated amount of traffic. And then in terms of disturbances, it's also elevated, kind of reflecting perhaps an increased traffic. Take a look at June, similar amounts of traffic, but what stands out to me in this graph is that the trend is kind of increasing year over year. So when we see that there's differences between month to month trends, and then we're seeing that lately since about 2019 that just the disturbance rate has increased. So it seems like there's something we may be missing in terms of understanding what pilots are doing if their behavior has changed. So from here, I'm gonna let Paul take over and he'll tell you about our outreach.
Okay, thanks so much, Lauren. I'm hoping that I'm coming through loud and clear. I've been having some computer issues this morning, which is why you've maybe seen me popping in and out. But can I just get some thumbs?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, sounds good. So I'm just going to give you an overview of Seabird Protection Network's work to protect common murre and France cormorants between Point Reyes and Point Sur. And so, you know, we are a program of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and a partnership of all of the agencies you see in this logo soup at the bottom of our screen that was started in 2007. And our mission is really to reduce human disturbance to common murres and cormorants. We have a very specific geography that we focus on as well as a focus on breeding colonies that Lauren's done such a good job of orienting us towards. We use a combination of tools, enforcement, regulations, and also outreach to get the job done. And our kind of small staff consists of myself, program director Karen Reyna, who does a whole lot of things as the resource protection coordinator at the Fairlawn Sanctuary, and two field staff. I know that one of them, Lauren Dung, is here today. And so I'm going to talk a bit more about how COVID kind of changed the outreach that we've done and presented some new challenges and how we've been responding to that. So a bit about our outreach program, which is our next slide. We're really lucky to have such detailed data on disturbances from our partners at the Common Murre Restoration Project. We know that majority of these disturbances are caused by boaters and pilots. We have even more specific data, right, that tells us that, for pilots, there are Coast Guard helicopter pilots, military pilots, and civilian, fixed wing pilots. And then for boaters, we reach out to kayakers, sailors, and recreational fishermen because they've all, caused disturbances in the past. So, we really see these groups as part of the solution to seabird disturbance at these colonies. And so the goal of our outreach program is to build long-term partnerships with leaders and members of these communities. So we've traditionally done this by spending lots of face time with boaters and pilots, doing things like giving presentations at their club meetings, distributing materials, and kind of going to the same air shows and boat shows year after year and kind of trying to meet people on their turf and talk to them and, distribute materials there. So, these are kind of a few opportunities that we've done that in the past. COVID-19 really changed things significantly to this outreach model, right? We went from doing kind of almost all in-person outreach to no in-person outreach. If you can flip to the next slide, Lauren. So we were really forced to bring our boater and pilot presentations online. Our partners also were really concerned about maintaining contact with their constituents. So, in the past, we'd worked with flight schools and with the FAA, and they also, wanted to do online outreach. So we were able to partner with them. And the immediate effect of switching to the online model meant that the number of participants went way up. So instead of having like 20 or 30 people at each one of our presentations, we'd have like 2 or 3 or sometimes even 400. And we really broadened our reach across California. But we conducted much less in-person outreach. We distributed fewer materials, and we basically cut off in-person contact with our constituents just as more people were on the water and in the air. But we'd also had this long experience of working with the boater community to a certain extent and to a greater extent with the pilot community on developing new messages. And we'd kind of been working with some key pilots just prior to the pandemic, and that really paid off. So I'll tell you a couple kind of keys to our success for online outreach. If you can flip to the next slide, you'll notice our presentation's not titled like how to protect California seabirds, right? Instead, we focus on messages that resonate with pilots. So pilots love sightseeing. And so we offer 10 secret sites only pilots can see. And that's kind of the hook to draw them in. And then within that framework, we talk about seabird colonies. We teach pilots how to identify them, kind of on the map, and then just using visual cues. Like this pilot in the photo is pointing to the Devil's Slide Rock area, and you can see these big white rocks in the distance, which is kind of the easy trick that we teach them. And then we ask them to fly above 1,000 feet to avoid causing disturbances. We also rely on trusted messengers. Trusted messenger marketing is something that you have definitely seen before. Think of like a dermatologist talking about the best sunscreen to prevent skin cancer. Like, it is a tried and true marketing technique. And so we found out that pilots love hearing from other more experienced pilots. We contracted with a former NOAA research pilot who's in this photo in the right, taking a 10-minute break. That's Matt Pickett. And so he would co-present with us, and pilots really like that. They trust experienced pilots to kind of give them tips on flying. They like hearing their stories. And so that's what Matt does, and it's very different coming from him than coming from a non-pilot like me, I've certainly gotten in front of my fair share of pilots and told them how to fly without much incident, but it resonates more coming from Matt, especially because he's flown this aircraft low over wildlife colonies to conduct research, and he's actually seen what wildlife disturbance looks like from the air, and he can kind of get up and say, this is a real thing that I've seen that happens, right? Because there is a certain degree of skepticism about whether low overflights can cause disturbance that we have seen. So during the presentation, we give pilots an action to take. I think this is on the next slide. We ask them to sign up for our monthly newsletter. That's, they say you get one thing, right? And so we tell them to sign up for our newsletter. And that's the beginning of what we see as a long-term relationship, right? We give pilots fun content, like the true story that inspired Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. And we also remind them, how to fly to avoid disturbing seabirds. So from there, we ask them to take an online pledge to fly above 1,000 feet. They can also take an in-person pledge, which we're seeing Gretchen Kelly from the Half Moon Bay Airport to do. And so, the more pilots take the pledge, the more photos we have to put on our website, and that leads to diffusion of our message within the pilot community. I'm going to talk quickly about boaters. For the boating community, we also rely on online presentations, but we realized we had a lot more work to do to understand our audience moving forward. So we've had staff in the field conducting surveys this summer and fall. So far, they've conducted close to 300 surveys, which is a great number. The good news is a lot of boaters know where special closures are, and that's kind of consistent with what the data shows. The surprise is that lots of boaters don't really know what we mean when we talk about seabirds. So they really tend to think of gulls, which are, kind of nuisance birds to them. Seabird colonies is also confusing, and it's also really tough for them to judge distance on the water. So telling them stay 1,000 feet away from seabird colonies is a message that maybe not be working. So we'll be using these results to craft more effective messages and revamp our materials. I'll talk quickly about kind of regulations as outreach tools. We have these special closures and NOAA regulated overflight zones that are great outreach tools, and they also have teeth for enforcement. But being able to point to them on the map and say these are places that you need to be aware of is really effective. So I'm being told to wrap it up. The one broad takeaway that I can share is that it's really important to get to know communities whose behavior you're trying to change, and learning about what they care about, where they get their information, and who they trust. You can develop better and more effective messages that will speak to their interests and what they want. And we're very lucky to have had the resources to invest in this. So even if it's just having a few conversations with your constituents, this will really pay off in the long term. I will leave it right there. We have a long summary slide and some acknowledgements of the many people that have been involved and contributed to the success of this project.